And we're back. This is going to be a post-mortem for my Ludum Dare 45 entry, Mini Minions. It's also going to be a bit of a post-mortem for the scripting language on which the game is built. I built that scripting language, and this was the first really big test of that. So we're going to talk about that. So this game was built by me solo within 72 hours for the jam portion of Ludum Dare 45. I built all the assets within that 72 hours, and it would have qualified for combo if I was faster or if it had taken less time. But it didn't. If ratings are still open for the Ludum Dare, please go play and rate the game before watching this. I don't want my thoughts on the game to influence your opinion of it. Okay, so let's start with an overview of the game so you have a sense of what it is in case you haven't played it. So this is me, down here in the bottom left, and these folks here are my minions out on this battlefield here. And I can drag them around and position them how I want. And if you've played an auto chess, you might recognize some of the aspects of this game pretty much immediately. This does take a lot of the mechanics from that sort of a game. There's a couple of spots here on this bench, effectively. These guys are going to sit out this next fight, and if I try to put them on the battlefield, there's too many people out there, so I can't have all of them out. But I position these folks as I want. So each of these minions has a set of stats. They get better as they fight more, they level up. They each have a type or multiple types, which is a little bit like a Pokemon type system of advantages and disadvantages. I also have a set of items here that may be slightly cropped by my head that I can use. So if I take this durian fruit, I can drop it on one of my dudes here, and that will increase their defense going forward. There's a fisherman here who wants to fight me, so I've kind of come up on this fisherman, and we are going to do battle. He's got a set of minions, but I don't know what those are yet. But he's a fisherman, so he's probably got some water type things. So we're going to remove this fire guy here and put in an electric dude. Because electric is good against water, fire not good against water. So I'm going to hit this ready, and then we're going to fight. And once I do, it's going to be hands off, and all of my minions will attack his. So let's do that. So we won. It was totally hands-off. There was nothing I did there. It was based on what I was bringing to the fight and levels and things like that. This is pretty far into a run, so my dudes are already pretty high level, and that was a pretty easy fight. But I fought off the fisherman, got some money, got some experience. Now I'm exploring, and I see a couple other possible minions that I can catch. So let's try to catch Turkleton. And here I have that same inventory in case it was cropped. And I'm going to use one of these binding scrolls to try to catch him. Great, I caught Turkleton. Now I can drag him out onto the field, except I don't have the slots, so he'll go on my bench. And now there's a fireman that wants to fight. So this continues. There's 3 fights in this region, effectively, that get progressively harder, and then I move to the next region. At the next region, a shop opens up that I can go and purchase things. The game continues for, I think there's 5 regions in the Ludum Dare version, and then that's kind of the end. There's not much of a victory condition. You just get to the end and it goes, thanks for playing. So yeah, that's an overview of what the game is like. So this was a weird Ludum Dare for a bunch of reasons, but to really explain why, I have to give you probably a ton of background information. So let's go back in time about 6 months. So 6 months ago, I was working on a scripting language to help me make games. So not necessarily like the actual game code itself, but a lot more like make robust and interesting content for games and really support modding in a kind of robust way. So I was working on that about 6 months ago, and a lot of making a language is, testing just in isolation, making sure the for loop works and the if works and the variables work and all of that. And so I was doing that and working kind of a little bit in a vacuum of kind of knowing roughly what that language was going to look like. And then about 3-4 months ago, I'd been playing some Dota Auto Chess and kind of liking it, not really loving it, but liking certain aspects of it. And I was listening to a podcast and heard this magical phrase, Pokemon Auto Chess, which as soon as I heard it, I was like immediately just like I stood up out of my chair and just shouted like, holy shit, which was very disturbing for the other passengers. It's a slight exaggeration, but it was a bit of a eureka, really, because like it was like, well, wait a minute, I can take these things that I'm liking about auto chess and the things that I like about Pokemon games and maybe combine them together and form something interesting. And after even just thinking about that a little bit, it was like, I need to work through this. And over the next like couple of hours, I paced around my house until I'd kind of like designed a lot of stuff in my head of like, what would a game like that even look like? How would it play? What could I do? I should use this as like a test bed for the scripting language. Like, let me build out what I would want the scripting language to look like for that game, and make sure that the language can support that. So for a couple of months, it was like, okay, well, I want enum support to work this way. So that needs language features, and then that needs like IDE features, because I'm also building an IDE for this. And it was this kind of process of going around and enhancing the language and enhancing this game and making things work, and like, oh, I need float support. So okay, I'll implement that. So I spent several months kind of working on that and never really actually getting to the part where it's a game. It was a lot of laying out groundwork and systems of how I would want to lay out like the content of a game. But again, not even really making the content, more just theoretical, like, okay, there's an object that represents an item in the game. There's an enum that represents the type system, and the types have weaknesses and things like that. So I'd written a bunch of code to kind of support that, but a lot of that was not fully tested. It was a lot of, here's what I want it to look like, but I hadn't gotten as far as fully testing stuff. We'll get back to that. And then I kind of put that project on hold and polished up another project and shipped it. So actually, if you go to itch.io and search for Binary Heresy, I just shipped that game. It is a procedural boss rush twin stick shooter that I quite like. So check it out on itch.io. Anyway, I shipped that, and that was right before Ludum Dare. And so that brings us up to Ludum Dare, I think. Going into Ludum Dare, as always, I kind of looked at the themes and generally had some brainstorming and some thoughts about where I might go, what I might do. The theme that was picked, I really didn't have anything for, and honestly couldn't think of a lot. Like, some of the ideas that I really wanted to do for some of the other themes just didn't fit. This seemed like a good idea. Like, let me take this game that I kind of have an idea of where it's going to go. I have a direction at least, and I have ostensibly some code, right? This will save me time, right? Let's turn that into a Ludum Dare project. Great. So that was kind of what I did. Okay, so I should probably talk a bit more about this scripting language and what it is and why I made it. So I've been making games for a decade now, and doing a bunch of Ludum Dares. I've shipped a bunch of things, and I have a fairly comprehensive library to build off of. It is, calling it a game engine is, I don't know, it's a nebulous term, but it's my game engine. It's what I work with. It's built on monogame and C#, and I've been building on top of that for years, and it's very powerful. It helps support the types of games I like to make, but I often find that I hard code things in C# still, and what I want to be able to support is more data-driven game development. And when I say data-driven, I mean really being able to robustly like support modding, say. That's kind of one of the big goals. If I'm hard coding things in C#, you can't really build off of that, and it's locked down to the binary. Like, yes, theoretically I could support mods if somebody built a component against my like libraries and interfaces, but it's not practical to really mod a game built like that. I see a lot of games out there that support modding, but a lot of their like data-driven design is like, okay, you have a spreadsheet and like there's the here's the model that it's using, and then here's a bunch of stats about it. And if I want to add a unit to the game, sure, I can. I can make a new model. Maybe that's really painful. I can recolor an existing one, swap that in, and then I can tweak the numbers or something. But I'm still using the template that's defined by the game developers. And that's not a knock against them or anything. It's just, it's a little bit limiting. And when I think of modding, like the gold standard is like Skyrim and Morrowind, where you can do a total conversion mod, and it's just like, oh, just swaps in these things. But you can also build whole areas and do robust scripting to do, I mean, basically everything the game can do. And like what I want to be able to support is something like a card game or something like that, where someone could make a card that is something I've never considered. I've never thought of putting these two features together or something like that. And to really support that, it has to be something like a scripting language. So that's what I've been developing. It's called Kilt. It's called Kilt because all the other names were taken. Literally, like I did a bunch of searching for like, what could I call this name? And oh, there's like something related to IT for every name I could come up with. So this is actually it. This is my IDE for the scripting language. And that is also built in my game engine. And this is the language. This is maybe the ideal use case that I was able to develop for this Ludum Dare project. These are the items in the inventory. There's a couple things that I think are important and useful here, which is there's a template of here's what an item can contain. But then each of the individual items has additional properties, and some of them have scripts of what happens when you do that in this place. And they can do things that they can do a lot more than just this. So, for example, I didn't create like a rare candy equivalent, basically because I forgot. But I could do that right now. That would be really easy. So if I said data, which defines, okay, this is a piece of data that will be statically available, and I can optionally give it a name. In this case, I don't really care. And it is an item. We're going to call it rare candy. And this would be where I would put in an icon, but I don't have an icon built for it, so that would be what I would do, is build an icon for it. And I can just say, like, okay, there's a description, which is level up. Great. And when this gets used on a unit, then what is it? It's unit level up. Well, I think I have a function for this, but I don't know where it is. So, but this would be the sort of thing that I don't have specific code to handle this, but because it's using a flexible scripting framework, it is easy to say like, okay, I want to do something new, building on top of this. So that's what that would be like. One of the other things that this lets me do is the scrolls, for example. There's like 4 levels of scrolls, and they're all identical except like there's minor tweaks to them. And what I can do is I can say, well, here's all of the scrolls are like this. They have these things in common, but each of them has different rarity, and the rarity affects the attributes of it. So the actual scrolls themselves can inherit from the template for that and just make the tweaks that they need to make. So it's pretty quick to knock out things like that, or programmatically, I could programmatically create a bunch of items like that fairly easily. So that's the language. It has a bunch of files here. Those are parsed by the game engine or by the game itself at runtime and compiled into a bytecode. That bytecode gets interpreted, and I have a bunch of interface methods for talking to the scripting language. Having a compile step is handy. It lets me do some amount of error checking if I were to do something that's invalid. I can get error checking in here, which is kind of nice. And I can run the game, or I can run the scripts and kind of make sure they initialize and potentially run things against them through this REPL interface. Anyway, I built this IDE, I built this language in order to support games, and this was the first opportunity to really take advantage of it and try it out in a really like real scenario. So we'll talk more about it later, but I think that background is useful. The one thing I haven't talked about is what is game data versus what is the game itself, and that's one of the we'll get more into this later, but that was one of the challenges, is where does that line drawn? So in this game, all the different fights you do are data, all of the minions are data in here, they're listed out, all of the items are listed out, all of the regions are data in here. Anyway, we'll talk more about this in a bit, but that's, I think, useful background as to what I'm talking about. All right, so that brings us up to the Ludum Dare weekend itself. When I first kind of had the idea to do this game, I really thought I could finish it in 48 hours for the compo. If I wasn't implementing the scripting language at the same time, I probably could have done about what I did, I think. I mean, like, I've done a bunch of Ludum Dares before, like I know the scale of the content and what would be needed, and I'm familiar with a lot of the interface stuff, and I probably lost around a day just to dealing with the bugs with the scripting language itself, the compiler, and the interface to from C# to the scripting language. It ate a lot of time that I wasn't planning on. I thought the scripting language was pretty much ready to, like, you know, do something with, and, you know, it wasn't, but the only way to find that out was to, you know, pull the Band-Aid off and see what was underneath. So the actual weekend itself, I ended up having to implement things in a weird order, I think. Like, once I got the basic grid on screen without any units on it, I jumped straight into, like, well, I should probably build that, like, capture interface, because eventually, like, that's how you're going to add things to the grid. It's not going to come from a save file. You're going to start from nothing, so you have to capture things. So that meant that I had to implement, like, okay, you pick these units and you go through that catch phase so you can catch them with your scrolls, which means the inventory needs to work, which is almost a minor detail, but it has to work at that point. And then okay, all right, great, now I need to get that onto the battlefield, so I had to implement that, like, little placeholder thing where you drag them on and get the, like, dragging and dropping to work, which dragging and dropping was a whole thing we'll talk about. And then getting them onto the bench, getting them placed on the grid, and then finally the actual, like, units fighting, which, like, seems like the core of the game. It was weird that I kind of did it in that order, and I think any other way would have been maybe weirder. But that did mean that, like, I didn't have minions on that map until, like, late Saturday, and that's not even moving around, that's just visible. And, like, at the time the compo was supposed to be submitted, like, I was about where I should have been the night before. Like, that was where there was a complete, like, game loop, technically, but that's, you know, a full day too late. So usually with Ludum Dare games, I'd like to have that whole, like, last day just for, like, content polish and balancing sort of stuff. But really on Monday, like, there were still features, like, big features that I had to implement. I'd implement the store, dragging items from your inventory onto the units, ranged units. That was, like, literally a last minute thing. And then the tutorial, like, none of that was implemented. Okay, let's talk about the art style of the game. I was definitely inspired by Pokemon, and in my head I was thinking, well, I could do something along that line, like that sort of style. And specifically, like, the Game Boy Advance era sprite work seems about what I would like to do if I had a ton of time. But when you get down to it, there's a lot of detail to that, and it would be very time consuming. And as I was looking for reference material, I stumbled onto some sprite sheets like this one here, which are what, like, Pokemon Yellow, at least, maybe the original two, would look like with a Super Game Boy, where the developers did some, like, palette swapping tricks, and it knew about the Super Game Boy. So the Pokemon actually had color to them, even though it was only using 4 colors like the Game Boy. So the normal Game Boy would just be 4 colors for everything, but the Super Game Boy would read it out and swap two of the colors. So if you look at all of these original Pokemon, they're all still four colors. There's white, black, and then two colors that were swapped in and out. And that seemed like a pretty doable sort of style. And between that and looking at some of like the references from that Super Game Boy version, it was like, okay, this is kind of a good art style. I could kind of target that. I could make a cohesive look around the game. And that's what I've aimed for. And I think I succeeded. I'd like to think I succeeded at least. Mostly. As you can see, each of the sprites has 2 frames of animation, which doesn't seem like a lot. I kind of try to vary it up a little bit by when you hover over them, or in certain situations they swip between them more quickly. I really wanted to have like a 4-directional thing, so I could swap them left and right, and have a back set of sprites so that they could walk away from the camera. But there was no time for that. And really, you don't notice, because I think during a fight there's a lot of things going on, so I think it works out. And just 2 frames with varying that up a little bit actually, I think, kind of gives them more life than other things I might have done. And this is kind of what some of the Pokemon games, at least, they'll have like little tiny sprites, and in menus you like select one of them. They'll do this exact same thing, which is kind of where I got the idea from. So I just drew the player character kind of based on some different Pokemon trainers that have been over the years. It's kind of roughly based on that, but it still sticks to that 4-color thing. And I'm pretty happy with the Pokemon trainer, except for the hair's a little bit weird. I wanted to do something a bit different, and I don't know what these purple stripes are supposed to be in retrospect. The enemy trainers I'm not as happy with. I wanted to kind of do a style that was quick and easy, and I thought this would work, but it really looks out of place, like this kind of chibi scrunched style. But it was a lot less work than kind of like the trainers from the Pokemon games, where they're more like the style of this trainer, but there's a lot more detail to those, and ultimately I think I only made like four images for the trainers, which isn't enough. You see the professor at the start, which you only see the one time. I meant to like have a final boss that was her again, and never got around to it. And then there's like 2 other trainers, and then the rest use this generic, just dude. One of the things I wanted to do is I really wanted something at the back of the arena to kind of give you a sense of like, where are you in this world? I'm not super happy with how it came out. Like, what I wanted to do was something that would be more handcrafted. Something like a line of grass, like an outline along like each corner, so that it kind of like gave you like a sense of like, okay, this is a circular space, and you can kind of see outlines and shapes and stuff in the background. But I was trying to figure that out, and like, this is going to be a lot of drawing, and I didn't think I could do it that fast. So I settled on, well, let's do little tiny sprites, the style of the Pokemon Yellow tile set, with just 4 colors, and I'll just do a little bit of like a random distribution in the corners to try to give them a sense of like, okay, that's where you are. But I'm not super happy with the look of that. Building the system to randomly place these things might have taken about as long as just hand drawing some like edges, even if it was like just mirroring some images or something. I don't know. I wanted something. It's okay. It's passable for Ludum Dare, I think. Okay, so what went right? Well, the gameplay loop itself is fairly fun, I think. I'm pretty happy with how that turned out. That really shouldn't be too much of a surprise. I'm taking a lot of the core fundamentals of other things that work, and it seemed like a pretty natural fit, and I was right. I'm also really happy that I was able to use my own scripting language. Like, that's really cool. I think that, hey, I built a scripting language and I built a game with it, like, as a proof of concept. It's not just, it's a scripting language I built for a class. Also, I think the game balance is pretty okay. Getting all that leveling right and the unit stats and that sort of stuff was more complicated than I was expecting, and I think it worked out. I mean, it's obviously easy and you can pretty easily cheese it out, but easy is probably good for a Ludum Dare-like game, and I think it generally works. I think it's about what I was aiming for. It's just a little more complicated than I was expecting, but I think it's solid and works. So, what didn't go right? Let's start with the things that had nothing to do with the scripting language. Start with that. It's a short list. Drag and drop was complicated. I've done drag and drop before within the game engine, and my game engine has support for doing that. But in all the previous cases, I think, well, most of the previous cases were fairly simple of drag this thing, drop it here, kind of a one-to-one or a one-to-many. And here, well, you need to drag from that like holding pen into the bench or the grid, and maybe you drag an item to one of those same places, or drag an item around the inventory. When I had to do something complicated before, I ended up hand rolling a lot of stuff and kind of manually doing some of the communication between components. And I'd have to like refigure that out, and I ended up just saying like I'm gonna do core game engine work to support this better, and like actually create a drop target that things get dropped off at. So then all the components that are like looking for things to be dropped off at them can handle that and listen for that event. So it was just more complicated than I was expecting. So the scripting language. When I had to debug the compiler on Saturday, it was pretty obvious that I wasn't going to make the compo deadline. And I really had to debug the compiler. There was kind of a major bug with the integration layer where I would say, hey, run this function, and it just wouldn't do anything. And it was kind of a silly error, but having to debug that, having to fix that in the middle of trying to rush out a game is not ideal. And it was the sort of thing where I just somehow had managed to miss this piece of functionality with like integrating between the game engine and the scripting language just didn't work. There are also several bugs in the compiler and several like in the interpreter that I worked around, but all of them are really nasty bugs, because it's, you're writing code and it looks right. Why is it failing? Did I forget to do something? And it's like, oh well, actually it's not passing a copy of the integer, it's passing the original reference to the integer in this case, when it really shouldn't. It doesn't make any sense to do that, but I mean, it's my own dumb code that did this. It's just not obvious that was the result, because it's a very specific case where that happened. I had a real fun bug where I would like say, I'm going to make a new object and I'm going to pass to that constructor the result of this function. And what it was doing was it was just ignoring the function call and just like passing the parameter straight into the object. It was like absolutely mind-blowing that happened, but hey, it's a bug in my code. And there were a couple other things that I just had to work around and forgot, and that was frustrating. And like I said, all those bugs were nasty bugs. Also, I really didn't fully consider everything that I would need for integration between the game engine and the scripting language. For example, I knew that with this game, I didn't want to have to deal with pathfinding at the scripting layer. Like, I didn't want to code a star in the scripting language so that each unit could say, what is the shortest path to this target, or find me the closest target. So I abstracted that out, and I said, all right, there's going to be an object in C# that is the board, represents the board, and the units will call into that for things like that, the things that would be expensive, and I already have pathfinding functions. I already have some of that stuff built out in C#. Like, it's just a lot of overhead to do that in the script. So I knew that was the thing I wanted to do, and I kind of had some plans around that. I had an object that the scripts would call into and call functions, and it could handle that. But I never thought through how you would construct a new object of that type from the script itself. And that's the sort of thing that doesn't sound that hard, but actually would have been a bunch of compiler changes and a whole bunch of new classes and things and systems that I didn't have. So I ended up doing kind of a hecky little workaround to do that, but I mean, I didn't plan that far ahead, I guess. Implementing the board in C# as opposed to the script also had some other problems that I didn't really predict when I was kind of architecting this out and designing it out. Ideally, I want to be able to test games in the IDE without needing to boot up the game, get to a state where they can do something. And that's kind of one of the things that the language supports pretty well is like, okay, I can just run arbitrary code and it's pretty easy to like insert a test that will, do the setup stuff and then run these steps and simulate things. But because the board is a C# object that exists in the game, which is a separate executable from the IDE that I have that can do these tests, I don't have that code and I can't fully simulate what the game is doing, which was a bummer towards the end of, or not towards the end, but pretty deep into development where there was a bug in some of like that fighting layer that was difficult to debug and would have been very easy if I was just able to like simulate the whole of like a fight. Like I had a mock object that represented a board, but all it was doing was returning stub methods to make sure that stuff technically didn't crash when I ran these sorts of tests. I ended up making a few more objects like that where there was a C# implementation of the object. It was a lot of work each time. I would have liked to have done it with even more, but like in a couple of cases, like some of the polymorphic cases, I don't know how I would do something like that without, well, now I know how I would do it, I think, but it's a total rewrite of the interpreter to do that. So I might do that. We'll see. I also wasn't sure how to handle asset loading. So like I can define an item and it uses this icon and I can load an icon from this folder, no problem. But like actually representing that and tracking it and loading it, I didn't fully handle, and I don't, like it works, obviously it functions, but I didn't have a good solution for it, and I ended up having a lot of cases where it's like the actual script object would just have a string, which is the path, and then I would look up the path from a dictionary and get the actual image file when it's needed for rendering and loading. And actually loading the assets is kind of a step that's kind of clunky because I have to pre-parse all of those images and then load them from a file in advance. You don't want to do that at runtime. So I end up with a very manual, kind of clunky solution for that, where I just had to scan through, like, okay, look at all the items, find the image file, throw that in this list, and preload it before you actually load into the game, which obviously isn't ideal, and I think could have been solved if I had better integration, like better rich object support that could be represented at the scripting layer. Generally, I think I struggled a bit with like what even should be implemented in the scripting layer and what should be in C#. Like I implemented a lot of things in the script that like maybe didn't make sense there, but it would have been pretty tricky to extrapolate them. It was a struggle, I think, to really figure out what would be the right thing at each place, particularly on a short time. Another big problem, I think, was the debugging of the scripting. I built a couple of debugging systems that I would integrate in the game. So ostensibly when I would hit an error, it would kick into the script debugger and pop open, oh, here's where it crashed, it's this line, and I could like read through the bytecode and go, oh, okay, it's loading this variable which doesn't exist, and I can just, my bad, I can fix that. But it wasn't good enough. One of the biggest problems is that having that embedded in the game is like that lives in the same process, and if there's an error in the script, like say I'm calling into the script to say, hey, run this function, give me this result. Well, like if that script fails, like then this code doesn't know how to continue, and if this code can't continue, the game engine can't really handle that and can't switch to the like debug panel. And just fundamentally with like monogame and C#, I don't have a good way to deal with that. I think like even thinking about it more, I don't have a good way to deal with that. And if it crashed during the draw thread, which happened a number of times, or if it crashed during the draw step, I suppose I should say, it would leave the application in a bad state where it would crash hard in a downstream place because things weren't cleaned up. and all of that made it just very difficult to really figure out like what is the problem with the script. One thing I definitely need to do is have a way to dump those errors to files so that I can just read them after the fact, along with more detail. The debugger didn't expose some elements of what was in the scripting layer, so it didn't expose the global variables. It just had like, here are the locals, which were fine most of the time, but every once in a while it was like, well, what's the state of this thing? I have like, when you get into that debug mode, there's like a command line REPL like interface, but that doesn't have like a good suggestion match, and it wasn't ideal. It was functional, but often I would fight with that, and it would take too long to get to the thing I needed because I didn't have a fully like explore the environment sort of a system, which I really needed. This was also the first real performance test of the scripting language, and I mean, it's a bytecode interpreter. I was like, it's probably fast enough. I think I'd done some very limited testing to be like, okay, I can do, tons of operations per second, and modern computers are pretty fast. I'm not doing something outrageously slow, but like it doesn't seem to drop frames generally, especially in release mode with at least my computer. Maybe an older computer would, but it's not as fast as I would want, certainly. Like it is an order of magnitude slower than I want for the scale of things that it is doing. Like I said, the whole of the update loop for the like fights are implemented in the script, and that's like the updates of like the AI of what do I do new at this time, and also the animations of where is it visually represented. So like it tries to be efficient in that like it is time stepped of like the brain of each unit is like plotting out on this, like this tick I'm doing this plus this tick, like x plus 5 I'm doing this, x plus 10 I'm doing this, and there's like that's like the code behind, and that's where like the damage is attributed and pathfinding is figured out. So it's kind of like that stuff is minimized. The animations run every frame, but like all told, it is taking more time than I would like. In debug mode, it's kind of getting close to that like 10-15 milliseconds per frame, which is about the border of what's acceptable. The other problem is I don't 100% know why. I've got good hunches, and I think I've got a pretty good understanding of like the problems, but I don't have a good tool. It's not hooked into some of the performance monitoring tools that I already have. I mean, I could probably do that, and if I had more time, I would and will. But I like at a very detailed level, I don't have good tools to be like, I would like ideally to say, where are the hot zones? That sort of a thing, and I don't have that. There was one obvious bottleneck I knew about, which was I implemented the particles and the damage numbers within the scripting system, which was almost certainly unnecessary, but like it would have been a bunch of work to do that any other way. So like that would have been a savings, but I think long term I want to do more with the game and make it more complicated and add more abilities and things, and right now that seems like a lot just based on how it's performing right now. So I need to do some major work there probably with the scripting engine. I did have some problems with my IDE as well, which is kind of just another layer of complication on top of all the others I've added. Having an IDE is nice. I mean, it means that I can do my own smart completion matching. I have integrated like running of the tests and a REPL interface so that I can like do a lot of testing and playing with things. There's integrated like a integrated test system that I have that lets me do additional tests. And that's all nice, but I did write this whole thing myself, and there's a couple of features that I've just not gotten around to that, it turns out really would have been very useful. First, I haven't implemented an undo, which, I mean, it's harder than it sounds if you haven't implemented an undo system before. That's a lot of manual work and tracking and things. But I haven't implemented that system, so whoops. It wasn't as bad as it sounds. That only really bit me once, and luckily I could just restore the file from a backup. But yeah, it would be really nice to do that, and I definitely do want to do it. It's on my to-do list. The other thing I don't have is I don't have a really good like search or like find, like I have some ideas on how that would work, and being able to know, like understand the language would let me do some really smart searches. But yeah, I just don't, I don't have that. So that was actually probably more frustrating, because there were a lot of times where, well, maybe this comes back to other problems. These files for the game are not necessarily laid out super well. Like if I want to find the model fight object, that's here in encounter, which is a weird place for it. And there's a lot of things like that where it made sense when I started, but towards the end it was like, where's that object again? Or like, I know I have a function that does this thing. Like there was one time where I spent like, well, this was after the fact, but I spent 10 minutes trying to track down, like, I know I wrote this code. It's like, it's running. Whenever I do the test, it was like spitting out stuff. And it was like, I don't remember where I put it. And that's the sort of thing where it's like, I really should have had a search, even a basic search. And it's not the hardest thing in the world. I just haven't gotten to it. So yeah, maybe I put a little bit too much complexity, all told, and too much on top of just making a game in a short amount of time when it comes down to it. So what's next for this game? I think it's a compelling enough direction for a game that I'll probably continue working on it for a while here. Before I really get back into the game development itself, though, I've got a long list of improvements I've got to make to the scripting language. Interpreter performance is probably the biggest thing, and really we're talking about like a full rewrite of the interpreter. But once that's in a better place, I think this is probably going to be my next big project. There's a lot of things I want to do to make it better, to make it like a complete game. Obviously, way more creatures would be good, way more minions. I don't know how many. The original Pokemon had 78, if you exclude the evolutions. Maybe somewhere in that range. I don't know. We'll see. Definitely want to add a lot more trainers, a lot more trainer variety, and actual sprites for a lot of them. I'd like to have bosses at the end of each region, so something you can you can see them coming and you can plan for them. Not necessarily okay, I'm going through the forest and at the end there's a guy that's really into forest creatures, but more maybe, there's a guy at the end that's really into ghosts. But you can see him coming, so you can as you're going through the forest, say, okay, that guy's coming, I'm going to pick up something that's good against ghosts. So these bosses would be things you have to beat those to continue, probably at the end some sort of final challenge like the Elite Four, say, for example. Something like that where there's kind of a final thing and then you win. I think the goal would be you would go through a run of the game probably in an hour or two. And I think it is a run-based game where things change up and you are reactive to what is there. So I think I need more biomes and variety and a more dynamic world, really. Maybe you don't always start in the forest. Maybe you don't start in any zone. You could start in maybe the beach or a snowy area or something of a subset of all the possible regions. But you go through, and which ones you go to next is randomized at the start. So, you really have a lot of variety and you have to work with what you have. And I think that's where the real heart of the game is that sort of, building a team of these minions that work well together based on what options you have kind of dynamically. I also really want to give each minion some sort of special ability, kind of like what you get with Dota of, they charge up to a thing and then do a thing, maybe apply a status effect, or there's a more powerful attack, or some sort of interesting movement thing, an area buff, maybe some flexibility in there where maybe different wild versions of the minions have different ones, or maybe you can train them to get new ones, things like that. I also want to do some sort of system for bonuses for matching types. Something I always like with Pokemon is I really want to do an all-fire team or something, and the game just doesn't really support that. Maybe you can, but it's a pretty big stretch, and I feel like the game doesn't encourage that sort of gym leader style of team. But I would want to explicitly support that and have that be an option. Maybe not as good as I want a mix of things, but an option at least. So you could if you have 2 fire Pokemon, you get some sort of chance to burn or some sort of thing like that. So something like that would be cool. I want to have more encounter options, and I don't even know necessarily what that means, other than it would be cool to, once in a great while you do something where you go to an area and fight a legendary minion, and then have a chance to capture it afterwards. Maybe not even like an every time, or maybe there's like conditions you have to fulfill in order to do something, but like events like that would be kind of cool, or other various encounters, like maybe a rival or something like that. Definitely there's a few minor things that, like, it would be nice to have an option to explore further in a specific biome. I think that I wanted to do that and just ran out of time, of like, I'm gonna eat this trail mix and then go back out and go hunt another minion out in the wild. Some option, like maybe not so you like infinitely are going through this area finding stuff, but sometimes you can say, I want to look more here to find something, or use like a lure or something to get a higher level, things like that, to kind of adjust your odds of what you find. I definitely want to redo the graphics and probably take it up a notch. The GBA Pokemon game, sprite work is about where I would want to aim for quality and color and resolution. Like, I like the aesthetic of the Super Game Boy thing, but I don't think it has that wide of an appeal. And I want more color and more interesting backgrounds, as opposed to that pretty white background. So some things I'm not as sure about. I don't know what a lose condition would be. Like right now in the game, if you just play through, you won't lose, you just keep going. You don't get any money, so maybe that's not great. You don't have a great experience, but you won't lose. But I don't know what that would even look like. Maybe it's like a trainer hit points, or a reputation, or a morale. I don't know now. That's I will have to figure that out. I'm also really not sure if there's going to be like an evolve equivalent. I've gone back and forth on this. It would be a lot of art and maybe not worth it. I don't know. I don't think I would do like the match 3 system that Auto Chess has, of combine 3 to get a slightly improved unit. But maybe it's a very limited thing. Very specific ones can change, but not remotely as wide-reaching as the Pokemons are. I definitely want to change how items work. Like right now, you can stack them in a really cheesy way. Just feed one of them hot peppers until you win. Like it's not really intentional, but that works because I didn't stop you from doing that. And like even stopping you from doing that would be work that I just didn't have time for. I didn't want to support that, but it's kind of the only way I could really figure out how to do it. I don't know what a improved item system would look like. Like I don't think there's like a full inventory thing. Like I don't remember which Auto Chess does it. But maybe it's you have one held item, that's it. Maybe that gets consumed during a fight, I don't know. Or maybe it's you have one held item and then you can like slap a sticker on them. I didn't talk about this earlier, but I thought it was really stupid that you like slap a sticker on these minions to like improve their like performance over a long period of time. It was a really stupid idea. I really like it. I don't know. Anyway, items, kind of an unknown. I think I can play with some stuff, and there's a lot of options there, so that'll probably be something I'll play with a lot. I'm also wondering, like, this is definitely a single-player game. I don't think there's going to be a multiplayer component to this. Like, it's a lot of work, and that's not, there's better multiplayer games that they would be competing with. So if it's just single player, maybe I can play with the format a bit. Maybe there's an option for you to throw a potion out to help one of your minions in a specific fight that you're worried about. That might be interesting. That might kind of break the game too. I don't know. But yeah, I'm not really sure. So anyway, that's all my thoughts about this Ludum Dare game. It was a lot of fun, and if you've stuck with me for this long, thanks for watching. I don't know what compelled you to watch this long, but hey, hope you got something out of it, and hope you learned something. So see you next time, I guess.